You know, a lot of water is good to wash with, and some is even good to drink, depending on where you live. But water and wood just don't mix. About 90% of the problems that you have with hardwood flooring come from too much moisture. It's a very good idea to check the moisture content, not only of the oak that you're bringing in, but also of the subfloor prior to introducing it to the house. What you're looking for is a good balance. You're not looking for whether it's too wet or too dry, but a good balance between the subfloor and the material you're going to be installing over it. We've checked this material when we brought it in. I'm getting a reading about 8 to 10 moisture content with this little moisture meter I'm using. I'm using a mini Lignomat. This type of moisture meter is about $100, and if you don't own one or don't want to buy one, I recommend highly that you borrow one from your wood dealer. Our subfloor is running about 8 to 10% moisture content, well within the range of what we need to have. For comparison purposes, I brought in a piece of flooring from my garage. It's been undercover but unheated for a number of months. And you can see it's running about 12 to 14% moisture content. That's too wet to install on this subfloor. It'd have to acclimate for a long period of time before it would be ready to install. Otherwise, we might have problems. To give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about here, I've drawn out a couple of diagrams. This first one is a real good example of a balanced type of installation, where the surface floor and the subfloor have been really well acclimated. They're equal or very near equal in moisture content. In this type of installation, you get a flat surface and a tight floor, and it stays that way as long as the environment stays the same. These next two are examples of where the floor has received some type of moisture impregnation. It could be from spilling something on the floor, it could be from moisture coming up from underneath. This first one is typically an example of where there's a trauma or where a floor has been flooded or some water's been spilled on the floor. The second here is an example of where the moisture typically has come up from the subfloor, or it may have come up from an uncovered crawl space area. Once these moisture damaged floors start to dry out, we have what is a very unsightly type of an effect, or large cracks developing between the boards. This comes primarily because of the crushed grain that occurs in here, compressed or compacted grain, and it'll never be the same again. You'll have these large cracks, and it's unsightly, but it's also not structurally sound because the boards are nailed here on the leading edge in most rows, and as they separate, the back edges of the boards start to lift up. Of course, every house and every region of the country is different, but even without these kinds of excessive moisture impregnations, you have to expect a certain amount of expansion and contraction in your wood floor. To allow for that, we have to have an expansion gap around the floor. Once we get a few boards installed, I'll show you what that expansion gap might look like. Now that we've prepared the subfloor, we're ready to talk a bit about layout. We said earlier that our car decking was running in an east-west direction in our floor. That means that our new flooring would have to run in a north-south direction. Now, in most instances, we would run from the widest to the most narrow part of our installation area. In our particular instance, that would mean we would run along this wall, the dining room-living room combination, and we would work towards the back bedroom doorway. One of the most important factors in laying out any floor is to determine the out-of-squareness of the rooms. There's no such thing as a square room. At least I know I've never met one. And ours is no different. I know from measurements I've taken earlier that if we were to reference our starting line parallel with this wall, we would end up with wedges, something like this, as we approached the opposite walls. We want to try to eliminate that if possible, or at least reduce it. In order to do that, we need to change our reference point. We need to modify it. So we establish a baseline. Now, this baseline takes into account this out-of-squareness of these rooms, but more importantly in our layout, it needs to take into account this focal point in the living room. It needs to make that border look good. I'll go lay out that line right now. Okay, I've marked my baseline with the help of my friend Dale here. Our baseline runs from the dining room wall all the way through into the opposite wall in the living room. We're fortunate in that our baseline is perfectly parallel with our hearth and the leading edge of our border around the hearth. And as it turns out, helps also to average out some of the wows in the walls that give us our out-of-squareness in our rooms. The next thing we're going to do is to install the border around the hearth by gluing and screwing. For a more precise fit, Actually mark the board you're going to be installing rather than measuring. If you're using wide plank for headers like we're doing here, you might find a radial arm saw will come in handy. Here Dale is marking the plane along which we'll insert the screws to attach the header. We're using a Fuller Type C bed here to drill our pilot hose and countersink. We'll be using a 2-inch flat-headed wood screw with a square drive to attach the header here. These are quite efficient when you're doing floor work. After dry fitting this leg of the header around my hearth, I noticed I had a high spot here I needed to take down with the edger before I could set it in place permanently. Just a couple more screws here and we'll have it down tight. If you look close, you'll notice a bit of a gap along the leading edge of the mitered portion of the inlay. I've done this intentionally so that it will tuck tight when the flooring is laid against it. Well, except for topping off the screw holes with wooden plugs that we've cut earlier, we're pretty much done with the border and inlay around the hearth. I thought I'd talk to you a bit about the inlay that we've used and the border. The inlay we've used is a combination of brass and ebony, two of the more difficult types of inlays to use, but also two of the more opulent. We've pre-drilled the brass and the ebony for the finish nails that attach it to the yoke. You notice we've taken the tongue off the one side so that we can attach the inlay. And on the other side, we've cut out a rabbet so it will fit tighter against the hearth.